Great.
All right, my friends, last time we spoke, we introduced Goethe's Faust, talked about basically the form and structure of the first part, and a little bit about how famous our figure Goethe was in contrast or in comparison with many of the great names that are often appended to masterpieces: Shakespeare, Cervantes, Homer, Virgil, Milton. Goethe is one of those names. He is the German one of those names. The same way that Don Quixote by Cervantes has affected more Spanish literature than any work in Spanish that has ever existed, so is the case with Goethe's Faust, though it comes about 200 years later. Starts fewer than 200 years later, but then he completes his work long after that. Remember that it took him 6 decades to write this single work. And the big question you will have when thinking of modernism, and particularly the very distinct 2 parts in this work, is, can a work written over 60 years really be the work of a single author? What do I mean? When people debate whether Homer actually wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey or sang them, it's unclear whether he was literate or not, and whether he was. People seem to argue that he was an oral bard, and so he must have memorized the 12,000 lines of the Odyssey and the 15,000 lines of the Iliad and various variants of these works that he would sing when he went to different geographical locations, right? You know, you go to Milwaukee and say, Milwaukee's the greatest city in the world. You go to Chicago and say, Chicago's the greatest city in the world. You adapt what you have to say to the place. Down here, I say, go Tigers. You know, I go to Harvard, I say, go Crimson, or go John Harvard. That's technically their mascot is a man, puritanical man. Just like Stanford, this is something they'll hold against you. They're not the tree. They're not the Cardinals. They're the cardinal. They're the tree. The tallest tree. You understand the symbolism they're going for there? The tallest tree, the single tree, one of one. They want to be like an Ivy League. In any case, I'm getting what I was saying. Based on that, Goethe, Faust. What was I just saying? I'm sorry. Yes. Something about Homer. My goodness. Well, in any case, I was saying that yes, right. A claim that people make when they suggest that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by different authors or sung by different authors is that they're very different in content and style. And this is sometimes seen as evidence for why one author would write about war and have conventions from the Iliad, and one would write about homecoming and marriage and the relations between men and women rather than men and men. That said, very intelligent English scholar, E.M.W. Tilliard, drew my attention to a good counter argument to that, which is, well, if you look at Shakespeare's corpus, 39 plays and a couple major poems, and over 100 excellent sonnets as well, and you look at some of his early work compared to some of his late tragic work, that he himself might appear like 2 different authors. And why? Well, because an author over the course of his or their life develops and can change. A more recent example is that many music fans, are any of you folk music fans? I'm not myself a folk music fan, but Bob Dylan is one of the bigger figures in folk. And he switched genres in the middle of his career. He went from being an acoustic guitar playing folk musician to playing an electric guitar. And many of his fans really disliked that because they thought he had corrupted his essence, gone against the genre that had made him big. But his claim is he's a musician, not just a folk artist. And so when you think about whether Goethe, single author, wrote this work, you really want to think about whether somebody writing in their 20s is the same person as somebody writing in their 80s. I mean, really think about that for a second. Think about if even you are the same as you were as a 12-year-old, or your 12-year-old self is the same as you as a 16-year-old, your 16-year-old self is the same as you as a 20-year-old if you've made it yet. And so a problem with asking whether this is a unity is the very question of, can you claim that a human writing at 4 different distinct times in his life is himself a unity, is himself conveying a singular perspective? Or is it more the case that at different stages in one's artistic life, or life as it is, that one is sort of a different person? I mean, in fact, if you look at, this is anecdotally, of course, the sorts of things that people who have been prisoners for a long time, or people who have not been caught for a major crime that they committed many years later. Something that you often hear 20 years later or so is, I'm not the same person who did that. I'm a totally different person now. And that seems to be something that we believe in a secular and a sacred way, right? We believe that if somebody does their time, they've done their time. There's certain crimes where you stay on lists, sexual offenses, for example, or you have permanent issues like you commit a felony, you have trouble voting, and things like that. But we also have sacred versions of that. Even the ancient Greeks had purification rituals. So Odysseus helped Achilles to purify himself after murdering the ugliest of the Achaeans named Thersites, a humpbacked, sparsely haired individual who always talked smack to him and Odysseus. But even the idea that is maintained in, say, Catholic theology of confessions. You can have it done. You can be done with something. And so that's something perhaps to keep in mind when thinking about the secular and sacred origins of criminality. All right. So last time we talked a little bit about the milieu, or the geographic and empire milieu that Goethe found himself in. Found himself in a time when empires were changing into nations. And in fact, certain empires were changing into democracies, like the French and the Americans as well. It was a time of great social, political upheaval that really culminates in the beginning of the 20th century, where we are heading to with modernism, where so much changes: the nature of religion, the nature of science, the nature of economics and business and work, where people live in cities as opposed to out in rural areas, and who rules them, emperors or the people, or some other sort of group of individuals in some other strange way. If you study political science, there are all sorts of ways that people group together. And we talked about that. But I need to say a little bit about the Faust legend itself. Like I've mentioned before, Don Quixote was a very novel novel in that Don Quixote was himself a character invented by Cervantes, and who, though Cervantes was satirizing a genre, chivalric romances as well as pastoral romances, two genres, he was really, in some ways, inventing his own. And one could intelligently make the argument that he is the inventor of the novel. Other contenders for that honor are the Roman Silver Age book called The Ass of Apuleius, and the Japanese work from the Heian Dynasty called The Tale of Genji as well, which is actually written by a woman in waiting who increased her own rank because of the Empress's love of her writing. Which is very interesting. Entertaining the elites is a good way to increase one's own status. But the Faust legend, unlike Don Quixote, did not spring from the single brilliant mind of one individual. It was a common legend. It was a folk tale. It was something that was told in the air. A lot of people say that this is what much of Greek mythology must have been like during the time in Athens, and even during the time of Homer, that the story of Odysseus already existed, but he's the one who set it to meter and started singing it in the most official epic form that we now receive for ourselves. This is the claim that's often made about the Faust legend too. Though I will add that Goethe is not the only famous writer ever to have written on the Faust legend. In fact, a very, very, very famous English writer from the time of Shakespeare named Christopher Marlowe is one of the Oxford wits. Shakespeare, he came from out of town. He was not university educated. He was sort of like Dante, sort of this amazing intellect that came out of nowhere. Whereas people like Thomas Kidd and Christopher Marlowe, tortured to death, by the way, they came from the most elite university in the world, where they were writing. A university where I'll get to present my dissertation research in 2 months, Oxford. And so, very interesting historical accident that these guys who were at the most elite academic institution and were considered basically some of the most elite minds in existence, pale in their impact compared to Shakespeare, who himself worked all of the jobs by tale at the theater, and in fact was himself also an actor and a writer. So Christopher Marlowe, prior to Goethe, wrote a work trying to codify this folk legend called The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. I, in one of my more hipster moments when I was an undergrad, used to claim that I liked that rendition of the Faust legend more than the one that we're going over now. Obviously, you can tell that I've changed my tune because this is the one being taught. All right, let's say some things. The Faust legend really begins in the 16th century. Note that the work that we're reading starts in the 18th century and is completed in the 19th century by 1832. So 16th century, that's 1500s. It's been around for about 300 years by the time Goethe puts his hand to it. So this, it's time for this legend to be written down and to take on its more stable form. And you should really think, when I say that, you think, what do you mean? You mean legend? Does that mean a lot of the legends that we hear are either just legends that happen to exist in the air right now? Or are the legends that were written down? What happened to all the other legends that weren't written down? This is where you start to get some sense of everything that disappears in time. And why even the argument can be made in Faust Part 2 by Mephistopheles that the past is the same as nothingness. That yes, right, that which we do not preserve fades away. And so how many myths, how many tales, how many beliefs have faded from existence because we didn't have a Goethe or Shakespeare or Cervantes to write them down? Countless. Hard to even feel the measure of such an impact. But that should also tell you, write things down or they disappear. So the Faust legend begins in the 16th century. It is associated with a historical figure named Georg Faust, who was himself a notorious alchemist, astrologer, physician, and magician. And notice the constellation of jobs there. Those jobs often went together. Alchemist, astrologer, physician, and magician. Remember that alchemist, al is the definite article in Arabic. So a lot of words that begin with al in Spanish and English come from Arabic, like algebra, and even certain characters that you probably knew this unconsciously, but now you know it officially. Al-Adin, Aladdin. But algebra, alchemy is the chemistry. And so we just got rid of the al and kept chemistry. In any case, we've talked before about the aims of alchemy. Two. One is to produce the Philosopher's Stone, which either makes a mortal person immortal. This is what happened in Nicholas Flamel produced who was a real alchemist, a Philosopher's Stone in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And when that Philosopher's Stone was destroyed at the end, which Voldemort was using in order to become immortal, then Nicholas Flamel sadly dies. The other cruder thing that such a stone is supposed to do, and perhaps this is an allegory for the first process, if you really think about it, is take crude matter, dross. Dross is a word for valueless matter, or valueless metal, even. Let's say iron's really high quality metal, but it's not worth that much. So say like something like iron. Lead is there we are. Lead is the usual example. Taking lead and using the magic of the Philosopher's Stone, turning it into gold. Obviously, alchemy and astrology, there's a lot of fiction in the practices of such arts. In fact, we call them pseudosciences. Now, pseudo, as in false, like pseudonym, false name. And so remember also I told you a little bit about physicians at this time, that was not the most highly respected physician, unlike today in Western medicine, and particularly America. Because of the amazing surgeons that we have. It's great. But this person worked a bunch of jobs that would make you think that he's sort of like a wizard, sort of a little bit on the edge of society, and perhaps is up to no good, and also perhaps as an astrologist and alchemist is a heretic, and is really working against the strictures of religion. Keep in mind, if one is a Christian at this time, one dies, that's fine. A mortal soul. It's go to heaven or to hell. But it would seem as if an alchemist does not accept this theology. Why become immortal on this planet if you believe that you have an immortal soul? In fact, rejoin God in a better, higher existence. And that is a problem with astrology And with alchemy, astrology gets into questions of determination. The movements of the planets are determine your personality, your personal characteristics, and your decisions. Well, then are you free? And if it's the planets, how does that accord with Christian or Jewish or Muslim theology in that you have free choice? And that seems to be the crux of being, because if you don't have free choice, how can you do what's good or bad? You're just a robot, right? You just do what you are inclined to do from the beginning. And if that's the case, then how are some people sent to hell and some people go to heaven if they are made to be the way that they are? In fact, these are arguments that are rehashed over and over again in sociology classes. By the way, they just take on a slightly new form. They're like, why are prisoners today? Why do they have a higher rate of recidivism? That's the society's fault. And then other people come up from the right and they'll say, no, it's personal liberties matter and they have agency, and that's their fault for making those decisions. And the people on the left will say, no, the problem is that the structures have forced them into these decisions, and so what decision could they possibly make? And this goes on and on and on, and it never ends. And that's one of the great conversations. And so there are problems theologically with being an astrologer and being an alchemist, and it is likely that such a figure would be heretical. And so when you see our Faust from this version of the legend making a deal with the devil, and doing all sorts of things that, I mean, he leads to murder, death, seizing of land, taking land from water in an unnatural sort of process. This person is not someone who is trying to live a Christian or religious life in any sense. He is very much living a secular life in which, remember what the conditions of his Faustian bargain are, is that if he has a moment where he wishes for another moment just like it, his soul is given up to Mephistopheles. It takes till the very end of this play, we'll talk about the genre a little bit more, for him actually to get there. And whether he does in fact experience that moment or not is an open question. We'll have to talk about the very, very end. Just a little bit tricky. All right, so 16th century. 1587, the first chapbook. A chapbook is a collection of legends and anecdotes in the vernacular, so it'd be in German, not in Latin, which is something that you would have to learn in school/university, which is not somewhere that everybody went at this time. Called The Story of Dr. Johann Faust. It appeared anonymously written in Frankfurt, likely the work of a Protestant pastor. One understands these sorts of things. Remember that Protestantism had come around 1517 with Luther. It was expanded in 1599, reprinted 22 times by 1600, revised again in 1674, and then 1725. In 1725 version is the version Goethe evidently used from a cheap pamphlet version circulating at his time. So what you are getting from this is that for about 130, 150, 160 years, 170, 180 actually, let me get my math right, 1587 all the way to 1790 or so, so 200 years, let's say, this work had been circulating and accumulating new details and being written and rewritten. And so the story was developing for this amount of time. That means it was very popular. The original chapbook was dramatized by the English playwright Christopher Marlowe as the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, as I mentioned. And there are some additional influences on this particular rendition of Faust. We have Milton's Adam and Satan. Obviously, the Satan figure is correlate to Mephistopheles. Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. In fact, we have a character from A Midsummer Night's Dream in A Pleasant Place, which begins Act 2, named Ariel. Ariel is like Ariel, as Sebastian the Crab says in The Little Mermaid. Ariel is a spirit of magic that is under the thumb of Prospero in The Tempest, one of Shakespeare's last works, and so is himself a figure for what fiction and what art is. And some people consider The Tempest by Shakespeare, in which a magician returns to society and gives up his magical craft, him saying goodbye to the craft of producing art, of producing productions, of producing plays in front of people. That to be a playwright is like to be a magician, right? you put people in front of people, and they're like dancing shadows, and they act as if they're doing things, but they aren't really fighting for Denmark or killing each other or advising each other to murder. They're really acting out some sort of interesting lie. And so when Ariel disappears, then it's like the show is over. And I'll have some interesting things to say about that at the very end of this lecture. Today, when we talk about the first three parts of part one that are themselves very metafictional, the dedication, the prologue in the theater, and the prologue in heaven, very odd things to, very odd way to start a so-called play. All right. Yes, and then Calderón de la Barca. That's a figure you should just know from the Spanish Golden Age, almost contemporary with Cervantes. Okay. History of writing this text. So I said that it took about 60 years, 6 decades rather, in the 50s, for Goethe to write this text, and he wrote it in starts and stops. So like Cervantes wrote Don Quixote in 2 parts, in at 2 different times in his life, 1605 and then again prior to 1615 when he published it in response to Avellaneda's spurious second part. Notice that this work was worked on over a much larger time and in double the amount of instances as well, further complicating whether it is in fact a unity and whether the author himself was we can call the author single, as it were. So 4 stages of composition over 6 decades. Begun in 1773, last corrected in 1832. So actually 59 years, very close to 60 exactly. So 1. The first bit of writing was called the Faust, and sometimes you add to something that is the archetype of something. So in the language would be Proto-Indo-European, which is a language that we theorize existed, but we don't have evidence existed, except from the similarities between languages that came from Proto-Indo-European. We do the same thing with hominids, by the way. We say, well, they're humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees. They must have all come from one ancestor, but we don't have any evidence for what that one ancestor was. And so that would be like an human, as it were. In any case, the Faust is Faust in its original form. It was the state of the manuscript in Weimar in 1775 when Goethe arrived to Wismaria in Germany, and primarily consists of the tragedy of Gretchen Marguerite. This is basically the first part. Goethe then added Forest and Cavern and Witch's Kitchen. These are chapters, scenes really from the first part. In Italy, more than a decade later, he very famously left his wife and children without saying anything for several months and went to Italy on what was called an Italian journey. And in fact, he wrote a work called The Italian Journey on this, talked very much about how Italy had such a beautiful climate that they could produce oranges, which I always thought of when I saw the mini oranges in San Diego, where I lived for many years. And then he also published this work, again, this is a decade later, so about 1785 or so, 1790 in fact here, without Dungeon. Remember, Dungeon's the very sad part at the end with Gretchen Marguerite talking about all that she's lost, her mother to poison. She's drowned her illegitimate child, and she will soon be beheaded because of her malfeasance. Though she is saved by a chorus of angels before she dies, and in fact is part of the chorus of angels that then return to collect Faust's soul after he dies at the end of part 2, act 5. Something to keep in mind when thinking about questions are, in what way does Marguerite, or Gretchen, if you prefer that name, no distinction between them, how does she relate to Dulcinea? And you might further complicate that question by saying, how does Gretchen relate to Helen, the love interest of the second part, who is herself a symbol of ultimate beauty from classical art? Helen is the most beautiful woman ever to have existed, is the idea behind her. So whenever she's played by an actual human, people are always disappointed. So they think, she's not the most. It's a very hard role to play, right? Like if I were playing Achilles or Hercules, people would be like, I don't know, probably should have been The Rock, And I'd be like, you're right. Do you really understand Achilles? In any case, you may want to wonder, how Dulcinea, who is herself based on an idea of beauty, relates to Gretchen, who is herself perhaps based on a projection by Faust, but certainly Helen, who is herself a character from classical mythology, who is known for being so beautiful that men could not control themselves around her. And remember that she was the wife of Menelaus, that was stolen by Paris of Troy. This is why there's Paris, France, by the way, but by the Trojans. And then 1,000 ships were launched to fight a 10-year-long war to drag her back to Sparta. And so, in what ways is that figure similar to Dulcinea? That's something I think you could really dig into for writing. So if you do want to, let me know. In any case, 1797, 7 years after 1790, Goethe returned to the play at the behest of his friend Schiller. Schiller was himself an excellent, amazing poet. Wrote a collection of prose works called something like, I'm going to paraphrase this slightly, on an aesthetic education, which are really beautiful, as well as many other poems himself. He was also a romantic poet. In fact, Goethe and Schiller would often write letters to each other and compare their styles. Schiller was a little bit more introverted and didn't write as much as Goethe. Goethe was a little bit more extroverted than he was. In any case, at his behest, he returns to the work, completes it by 1808. It takes him 11 years this time around. Added the prologues, the second half of Night, the packed scenes, and Walpurgis Night. By the mid-20s, he published Act 3 of Part 2, which is Helen, the Helen episode, in which we meet Euphorion. In 1827, summer 1831, he sealed the complete manuscript of Part 2 for publication after his death. Just one thing you might do if you were a scholar, you decide you want to be a scholar, a German scholar, or a scholar in some other humanities department who studied Goethe. An argument you might make that you wanted to put into print is that you found what you think is the real Goethe and the real Faust. And you might say something like, it's not actually, it comes in 1797. This is when the essence of the play makes its way in. Or you might say that it's really when Dungeon is added that this play becomes what it is, and everything after that is epilogue. That would be like a scholarly thing to say. That said, we receive it as it is. I leave it to you to make such arguments. And I repeat a question that I asked earlier. Can this work possibly be defined as unified? And I don't even have all the evidence that I'm going to mount against that question yet. I have not presented it all. Like Don Quixote, the second part was unplanned in the beginning. Is not exactly true. One thing I will say is that the second part was actually planned from the beginning, from prior to the first part being written. But how it was all going to work together, that was entirely unclear. So a little asterisk added to this comment. There was another scholar who hipped me to that idea. I had to learn from him. So I'm glad that I did. This also obviously subverts Aristotle's unities of time and place. The idea that Aristotle put forth in his Art of Poetry, his Ars Poetica, is that all theatrical presentations should take place in one space in the span of 24 hours. In fact, so if you read Greek tragedies, you'll see that all the action always happens off the stage. That when Oedipus has taken out his eyes after learning that he laid with his mother and killed his father, you hear about that from a messenger speech. When you hear that Antigone has taken her life because of her uncle Creon's edicts against her, you hear about that off stage. And so you always hear about action happening in Greek tragedy in order to maintain these unities. Here we have it actually represented in front of us, and there seems to be a tremendous amount of time between part 1 and part 2 itself. And so these unities are not maintained. This is very much a modern work in that it does not maintain classical sensibilities. Obviously, that's true of Cervantes and Don Quixote as well. So, what is the genre of this text? It presents itself as a stage performance in part 1 anyway, and there are elements of stage performance like scenes and acts in part 2, but it also calls itself a tragedy. Something weird about it being a tragedy is that at the end of part 1, somebody is saved in a salvific way. At the end of part 2, though somebody dies, he's been saved. A comedy, at least since the time of Dante, Dante wrote a work called Comedy, the Commedia. And why it's sometimes called the comedy is it goes from hell, purgatory, to heaven. There's a trajectory going up from the worst place in existence to the best place in existence, all the way down to the deepest bowels of hell where Lucifer is. In fact, he climbs up the fur of Lucifer's legs in Cocytus, the lowest circle of hell. But then he eventually makes it to an image of God at the end. And so the idea is, why is this called a comedy? Well, because unlike a tragedy, it doesn't end with something that's sad or bad or negative or tragic. It doesn't simply end with death. It ends with the ultimate human ecstatic experience, which is a vision of God for a Catholic, particularly a medieval 14th century. And so, what does it mean to call this work a tragedy? The protagonist is saved at the end. The person that he does ostensibly the most harm to, minus Philemon and Glaucus, right at the end, who he also has murdered, though he doesn't mean to, though it is on his orders that they end up dying. How is this work a tragedy? It doesn't seem to be either a stage performance or a tragedy. It seems to be something like an epic poem, 12,000 lines, something that's meant to be read. And so, something, again, you want to think about is, what is the genre of this work, and what is it meant to be? Let me add to that. The first part and the second part are clearly extremely different genres. The first part is a personalist, subjective tale of lust and of world weariness, and an individual who is something like a genius professor and doctor. He's like the best of the best around at this time, but it's all turned to ash in his mouth. He's like Midas with the touch after he's lost the ability to eat and to embrace his own dog. In achieving what he wished to achieve, he's lost his desire, or it's almost like he's lost the most fundamental human thing there is, which is to desire the next thing, or to aim at what he desires. He doesn't even know what he desires. He's engaging in magic now in order to figure out the next thing. And it turns out that what he has missed in life during all of his study is human connection and some sort of relationship to the feminine and to a woman. And he chooses somebody who is perhaps a bad choice, and then impregnates her illegitimately, does not marry her, so he's given into lust with her, and then leads to her life really spiraling out of her control, and then to the dungeon, and then eventually to her death and salvation. The second part is sometimes called classical, whereas the first part is called romantic. Romantic is about feeling and emotion and an individual, whereas the second part has procession after procession. It involves Faust and Mephistopheles meeting an emperor, coming up with a scheme to cause inflation to create paper money. Faust then meets his old friend Wagner, who he has a conversation with in part 1, and who very much venerates his older colleague as an extraordinarily impressive scholar. And this guy is making a homunculus, which is itself an artificial human. Hominus, or homo hominis, is how you say in Latin human, but homunculus is like a little, a diminutive. And that homunculus, in striving for life, will end up dissipating itself on the waters. To Act 3, we have Helen, we meet the ideal of beauty, Helen, who is herself taken from these abstract mythological figures called the mothers. And Faust joins with her and creates a son named Euphora, who unfortunately, very sadly, like Icarus, flies too close to the sun in pursuing this fire-like nymph, and then dies, and then requests that Helen meet him in the underworld. Faust finds himself alone again. He then returns to working with the emperor and turning his attention to helping the emperor in battle against some anti-emperor. And then many years pass, and he helps to develop society. But in developing society, he does things that displace and kill other people. So though he advances society, it progresses at great cost. others. And then the fifth part, there's one last thing that he wants in all the world. There's two really. He wants the swampish land to be cleared of water, sort of like New Orleans, so it can become land. It's the last place on earth that he really wants. Also, right next to that is a little chapel with this Bacchus and Philemon. They're working. You may know who they are, but they come from mythology, Ovid's Metamorphoses. Bacchus and Philemon were two characters, old people, who Zeus and Mercury, Hermes, visit and in disguise. And so Bacchus and Philemon are so kind that they're running around trying to get their best chicken to feed to Zeus and to Hermes because they're so hospitable. And you got to keep in mind that the Olympian gods are not exactly nice. They're like really chads, you might say, like they're extremely powerful and beautiful, and they laugh they even laugh at the disfigurement of their own brother and son, Hephaestus, at the beginning of the Iliad. So, and also Hephaestus' own brother Ares cheats with their mutual sister, who is Hephaestus' wife, Aphrodite. And so Zeus and Hermes laugh at these two old people, and in laughing, their laughter is so glorious that they reveal that they're gods. And so Bacchus and Philemon, they fall on their knees, they're like, oh my gods, we don't have the appropriate hospitality for you. And Zeus and Hermes say, actually, we're going to burn down this city right next to you tomorrow, but you were so hospitable that we decided to save you. You should see a very strong connection between this and the story of Sodom in the Old Testament, by the way. A lot of similarities between them. I don't know what connection there would be, but archetypally, these are very similar stories. And so Bacchus and Philemon are then made into temple guardians of a temple that is put in their home. And so, boom, bring them back from classical mythology into the Faust legend, and they are visited by a stranger. Who is this stranger? Who is the stranger that is visiting them? And that after they die of fright, is killed by the three giant men? Probably something like a god. And so Faust finds himself committing something like ultimate sacrilege by the end of part 2 in a way that it perhaps even surpasses what he had done, the wrong that he had done to Gretchen. Like, not only does he wrong these two figures who are priests of gods that they serve, but also perhaps a figure of a god himself. Unclear which god. Is this one of the pagan gods of whom we've seen so many, like Plutus, the god of wealth, in part 2, or is it the same god that we see represented in part 1, who is in fact God the Father? Hard to say. Is Faust attempting to kill God at the, or rather, is he responsible for killing God because it wasn't his desire to kill Bacchus and Philemon, but he did want their land, and so when they refuse to move, his henchman Mephistopheles with his three giants do what they have to do to invoke his will. Sort of a dirty situation. In any case, what I mean to say is that part 2 is not only extremely different generically from part 1, but they don't even seem to be very much connected to each other, except for the fact that Faust and Mephistopheles are in one and the other, and then there's a sort of salvation at the end. And then we see Marguerite for the first time in part 2 after not being mentioned at all during the course of it, after a very dramatic sort of death scene or final parting with Faust. All right, a couple things to say that these may be quotes that you wish to access when writing about Faust. Faust has been seen as the paradigmatic text of modernity, almost since its conception. By 1836, Karl Gutzkow was claiming that Goethe was set by the gods as a boundary stone to mark where the past ends and modernity begins. While for Matthew Arnold, himself a very famous writer of fairy tales, English, he was the great manifestation of the modern spirit. Next quote. Europe entered the 18th century with institutions and structures still defined in terms of a cosmos ordered by a divine principle. This goes to what I was saying last time, how Faust is one of these first representatives of a secular human, a person who does not live in accordance with sacred scripture. But increasingly, the universe was felt to operate on its own, and sometimes seemed entirely the product of natural processes. This is, in fact, something that Faust makes the claim of during part two, that it's nature that creates all things rather than simply God. And so, and there have been scientists that would say similar things. At the margins, again, there are certain issues like what did create the beginning? It's hard to answer these sorts of questions. Could it be the act of a divinity? What is a divinity even like? You know, would an eternal motion that moves throughout the universe be the same thing? These are the sorts of questions that cosmologists look into in a very sort of religious way. In any case, the resulting sense of crisis as the old institutions no longer corresponded to the naturalized world is reflected in political upheavals, the American and French revolutions, the Napoleonic Wars, the Restoration and the July Revolution of 1830. In literature and the arts, the upheaval is generally identified as Romanticism. In philosophy, as the Kantian Revolution. I can say a little bit about that in a second. In economics and technology, as the Industrial Revolution. To understand Faust as modern, one must read it against these various revolutions. So political revolutions, religious, scientific revolutions, philosophical revolutions. What Kant did, by the way, late 18th century philosopher who sort of restructured the nature of philosophy. And after him, major thinkers come like G.W.F. Hegel. His name was Immanuel Kant. And I should probably say that Goethe, I keep calling him Goethe, his very regal name, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And that von is like the de from Spanish, indicates rank. Von means he is of a place. So he is of elite status. But Kant, what he did for philosophy was rather than saying that humans had access to or had the potential to understand universal principles, he said, well, humans actually have a very particular subjective psychology. So probably actually humans aren't seeing the world as it is. They see the world as they are made to see the world. So there's a certain visual spectrum for humans, right? And a certain auditory spectrum. Like you probably have these hearing tests where you can't really even hear this last thing, or there's like some color in front of you and it has or these like fuzzy things that move. I don't know if you've ever had an eye exam, you probably don't see that. You are, according to Kant, subject or imprisoned by your senses and the structure of your body and being. So you can only see things in a human way rather than a universal way. And so what he starts to study are the psychological processes and physical aspects of a human's mind. Saying we never see outside of ourselves. We see through ourselves. And so we need to understand the instrument that is seen rather than try and understand the thing that is outside of the instrument. You understand the distinction there. He is denying to us the ability to see the world as it is and reducing us to a creature that can only see as it sees. But in order to become more than that, we must understand the limitations of our own perceptual structures. And that can enable us to liberate ourselves. It's a major revolution and a major, in some people's mind, especially people who studied classics and the Middle Ages, a major degeneration of what a human is and of what philosophy is. In any case, a couple more things. Some data about this work to make the argument that perhaps it's a person, or to determine whether it is just a work of world literature or a work of masterful origin, a masterpiece. And do remember that Goethe was the person who, there's debate about this, either came up with the idea of Weltliteratur, world literature, or first popularized it. It depends on how technical the scholar is. But this work is 12,000 lines long, 2 distinct parts written over 59 years, integrates romantic, neoclassical themes, Spanish, English, and classical influences, including Ovid, Lucan, Homer, Hesiod, Virgil, and Apollonius. There are 44 distinct translations into English alone, and there continue to be constant adaptations of it, including now, I guess, historical features like the Little Shop of Horrors. Have any of you ever seen that? Little Shop of Horrors has a giant Venus flytrap who eats people, and Rick Moranis is in it. Rick Moranis is a very interesting actor. He left the spotlight in order after his wife died in order to take care of his kids, and never came back to it. And then also Bedazzled, which featured a female Mephistopheles, Lucifer, Elizabeth Hurley during her prime. There are also musical works like by Schubert, Gretchen am Spinnrad, and numberless other works there. You are welcome to listen to that work if you would like to, and you can. I'll get YouTube copyrighted if I play it right now. Memory or metempsychosis, the relationship between the prologue in heaven and the Old Testament or Jewish Bible book of Job. There's a sort of a combat between, or rather, there's a wager. That's a wager between God and Faust. In the same way that there's a wager between God and the accuser in the book of Job. You may know the book of Job. It's one of the longer Old Testament stories, but this guy Job is considered highly just. And the accuser, he's not yet called the devil in this tradition, goes to God. They have a conversation and he says, I bet I'll get him to deny you to your face if I just take enough away from him. Because though he's the justest man around, the most righteous, it's because he has everything. He has wealth, he has health, he has a family, he has property. Let me take these things from him, curse you to your face. And so Job is afflicted because of this. He loses all of his family members. His friends moralize him. He loses his health and is soon to die. And he actually gets to have an argument with God near the end. Can you put Leviathan on a hook? Did you put Behemoth across the lands? God asks to him. It is a very significant, interesting story, but also a strange story ethically, because what does it mean for God to choose a person, to put them to the test and to torture them basically to death in order to show how righteous they are? How does that action square in an ethical universe? And we see that the same sort of bargain, or rather wager, is made between Mephistopheles and Faust. Mephistopheles says he can corrupt this Faust character, though he does it in a different way. He doesn't take everything away from Faust. He offers to give him everything, as it were. One last thing I'm going to say before we go. So the question you may have been wondering is, why is Mephistopheles, who's clearly the devil, not called the devil or Satan or Lucifer? Quick little language lesson. Devil comes from German, Teufel. Lucifer comes from Latin. It means light bearer. Lux means light. Pharaoh means to bear. Satan is Hebrew and means accuser, is what the character in Job is called. Mephistopheles, a lot more sophisticated, Greek. And it comes from the unreal negator in Greek, may. May and u mean not in Greek. So not. Thales either comes from, we think comes from Philis or Philia, like Philadelphia, which means love, so not love. And then fist could mean a couple things. It could mean Phos, light, or Faust, or it can come from this word mephiticus, which means a noxious vapor. But let's see. So not love, light. Oh, that sounds like the devil. You know, he lives in this dark, gloomy place, and so he hates the light. And light is often a representation of God. Or not lover of Faust, he's trying to corrupt him. Or he is like a poisonous vapor, and then he gets into you and then eventually kills you. But that is why he's called Mephistopheles, and that's why in Cats there's a Mr. Mephistopheles. And that's where we're going to end today. All right, laissez le bon temps rouler, but be safe, my friends. Be